My name is David Pluviose, and welcome to In the Margins. Today, we're so pleased to have as our guest Dr. Erika Moore, who serves as Assistant Professor in the Department of Material Science and Engineering at the University of Florida. Erika, welcome. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for In the Margins. I'd like to just get right to it, Erika. Of course, you have written about your journey to the academy, but from a unique vantage point. Interestingly enough, much has been said about the need and the desire to diversify STEM fields in particular, right? To attract more women, more underrepresented minorities to STEM fields. But that journey is rocky for many of us without generational wealth, as you have written about. For so many individuals from underrepresented groups, they're not coming with generational wealth. They're not coming with advantages. They're having to work and struggle their way through grad school. And so while we want to see so many underrepresented minorities actually opt for STEM fields, some of these other disciplines where minorities are underrepresented, the reality is that the amount of debt that so many underrepresented minorities have to incur just to make it really makes the journey not very worth it. And so you've written extensively on these issues, but I was wondering if you could talk about, first of all, your own journey to the academy and some of the obstacles and pitfalls that you had to encounter along the way.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity, David. I'm humbled to speak about my experience and then hopefully be able to use my voice to help others. That's truly my goal. And so I think, if I were to reflect and figure out how I got to be in the position today, it's really through, kind of this haphazard approach where I didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't really understand the finances of higher ed, right? And I think that plagues many people. When I started out in undergrad, I unknowingly accrued a lot of debt, a lot of student loan debt, and I was still in engineering. And so people are kind of like, oh, you're good, you can pay that off, it shouldn't be a problem. But if, as you said, if you want to pursue academia, it's kind of this progression of delayed career, progression. So you finish your bachelor's degree, you go to graduate school, you have to graduate from your PhD and be hooded, and then usually do a postdoc and then come into the academy. And what happens throughout all of those years, right, is you've been limited in salary and what you can earn. And you basically have to rely on super limited student stipends to be able to leverage and achieve all of those goals. And so what you see is this narrowing of who can get into the academy, as you already alluded to, right? It's like, we want all of these people, we want diverse faculty, but here are these major financial barriers that limit the majority of people from underrepresented or historically excluded backgrounds from pursuing these jobs, right? Because who can take 10 years making far below what they could earn with their degree to pursue this higher goal of joining the professorate, right? Not many people can do that. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to learn how to utilize my financial literacy and teach myself financial literacy in order to basically pay off my student loans, live like a student for a long time. Even to this day, I still shop at thrift stores and do other things to basically minimize my financial footprint or how much money I need to live off of so that I could pursue these higher goals of being, an assistant professor here at the University of Florida.
And I was wondering if you might talk about the vision that you had to be a professor. beyond, of course, the finances, and I want to talk a little more about that in just a little bit. I was wondering if you could talk about the vision that you had. When did you decide that you wanted to go into STEM as a professor? And talk about that envisioning. How did that happen for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I first knew I was interested in STEM when I dissected a fetal pig in the 6th grade. And I knew that I wanted to have a job where I was able to interface with human health, right? Like being able to understand, design for, and manipulate human health. That still is very exciting to me. But in terms of when I wanted to be a professor, it's still an evolving desire. And the reason why it's still evolving is because when I was in graduate school, I knew that to become a professor meant a set of different sacrifices. And because of lack of representation, I never really thought that I would become a professor. In fact, if you ask most people throughout graduate school, I said I was going to go back into industry and just work in industry for the rest of my life. What happened to change it is I had some very powerful mentors who were historically excluded. So one of my mentors identifies as a Black man. The other identifies as a white woman. The other one identifies also as a white woman. And then I was also able to speak to other women of color who were assistant professors in engineering. And they basically allowed me to see myself in the role. So at the very end of graduate school is when I realized that becoming a professor was something that I could do. It wasn't until then, and without my mentors and these examples that were set before me, I really never thought it was possible for me to be a professor in this space.
And I wonder if you talk a little bit about your interaction with your colleagues at the University of Florida, how you've been received into the professoriate. We've written in Diverse quite a bit about, of course, it's not enough to recruit underrepresented professors, but retaining them is key, right? When they get into the departments, it is the mentoring in place? What's the climate like? Is it made clear what the tenure is, or is it opaque and only those kind of who are in the club understand what it takes to be successful? I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the experience at the University of Florida as a new professor and how you were received within your own department.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because a sense of belonging and specifically creating or cultivating a sense of community is largely the number one determinant for faculty success. And I think it often gets overlooked, but at the University of Florida, in the College of Engineering, the Wertheim College of Engineering, we have the most number of Black women tenure track engineering faculty in the nation. And I knew that when I was recruited here. And it was a major, pivot point for me, considering my place in academia, right? Because so often you're just the one, you're the only one, you're the token, you're put on all the DEI, committees, you're made to do a lot of extra service. And that's just you, that's your role. You get limited to it, right? Especially as a Black woman. But coming to the University of Florida, my chair, the chair of material science and engineering, is a Black woman. And I had never seen that before. I have colleagues that are Black women in my department. And I have a lot of colleagues that represent a broad swath of different diversity. So a lot of women, people who identify as non-gendered, other people who represent diversity in the academy that had not previously been visible. And that was the difference for me being recruited here. And then if we switch to retention, what we've been able to see being here is that there is a community of junior faculty who, we had a massive hiring endeavor that was led by our dean, Cami Abernathy, who really transformed the state of this college and the state of my department. And so I feel quite a deep sense of community here. We actually had a retreat with a few of the Black women who are tenure track in engineering. And we just went away and had a weekend together where we just celebrated and fellowship with each other. And I was like, I don't think that could happen at any other university, right? And so what we've been able to create here is truly special. And it's given me a broader sense of belonging. I'm not the only one. We can relate to each other. There is an unspoken, agreement or association and belonging that we have here. It's kind of like when you see someone walking by, you can give them the nod. They give you the nod and you understand what that means. And that's what's here at the University of Florida for me. And so I do feel quite privileged to have that, because I know that's not the case for many other Black women faculty, especially in engineering.
So many institutions are trying to replicate the experience that you say that you have had at the University of Florida, really struggling to not just attract, but to keep their underrepresented minority faculty, and culture, as you indicated, is so key. And so I was wondering if you might have a word to say to any department chairs and administrators at other institutions with regards to why University of Florida has had success, and what are some of the keys and takeaways that you could share with administrators across the country who are seeking to similarly foster a culture that retains minority faculty.
Yeah, I would start with something that I think all administrators and chairs will understand. Money speaks louder than words. So in the climate of academia, we often use words to say, oh, we really believe in this, to espouse values. But those words without funding are almost meaningless, especially given the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the systemic racism that's just plagued higher education. And so there need to be finances to support the values that are espoused by these universities. And what I mean by that is saying, okay, you're saying you want to hire more diverse candidates. Where's your money to go out, recruit, find, and retain those candidates? Do you have funding for retreats? Do you have funding for additional aid, right? There have been a lot of papers that have come out by some of my colleagues talking about the disparities in funding. Even as recent as last week, where the National Science Foundation highlighted kind of the fact that if you're a white researcher, you're more likely to fund white researchers. And so if you want to support changing the culture and climate of your university, you need to put your money where your mouth is. And that's what I think all administrators should know. I think that's what we've done here at the University of Florida. And you can kind of see the effects and the ramifications of that support, because money, I think it makes a difference, not to go all the way back to finance, but money touches everything. We can't touch anything in the world without paying for it, without having some dollar value for it, right? Even if it's just our time. And so that's how I think in terms of what administrators can do: put money, put resources in place, stop over leveraging your faculty of color, and get staff in the place of them, right, to serve in those service positions. Let them do their role and support them financially.
That's phenomenal. And of course, you mentioned money and finance, although interestingly enough, there are some very well endowed institutions that still struggle, in fact. And so what would you say to them? Because there are some institutions that put major investment in DEI, but may still struggle to see substantial returns. Anything else you might say to those that say, hey, we've invested, but we haven't seen? What can
That's a really great question, because then the conundrum becomes, to me, one of culture and environment. So if you have fertile soil, right, why aren't the seeds taking root and being planted there, right? That's almost the question that you're asking. And so then you have to ask, okay, is the conditioning, is the nature that's in, or the nurturing that's in that environment, not fostering a sense of belonging. Maybe it's regionally, people don't want to live there. Maybe there are other elements or aspects that are not supportive of recruiting diverse or historically excluded faculty. And that's something that it's hard to kind of break into, right? Because then you have to do a deep dive into what the culture is and understand how you can change or track the culture, right? I do think that's a harder piece or puzzle to fill in, but I would encourage people to understand the culture of their environment, right? For people who are there, who are non-majority, why did they stay? What parts of that culture or community helped it make it easier for them to stay, and what parts of the culture make it harder for them to stay, right? And then how can you leverage the strengths and weaknesses that are at each institution in each place to basically make the environment better for more people, if that makes sense.
Thanks so much. I actually have a question about your research. I noted that you've already won, I think, a major award with regards to your work around health disparities. I was wondering if you could talk about your research and the extent to which it kind of relates to your passions around health. Because you mentioned pandemic, so much has happened just around the pandemic with regards to understanding the disproportionate impact of comorbidities on underrepresented minorities. And so, some would say, hey, the pandemic did not cause disparities. Some would say it just revealed what's always been going on. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research and how it's touched some of your own personal passions.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that being a professor and conducting research puts me in a position of privilege. And so, in my passion, with that privilege, I tried to align my passion to ask questions that I felt were previously overlooked in biomedical research. And one of those passions became a lot of the projects that we study in our group. So we use biomaterials to create tissue models, organoid models outside of the body, right? So we can have a little tissue upstairs in the lab, and we can ask different questions based on the tissue that we create. And so one of the projects that we study is related to health disparity. We study systemic lupus erythematosus. And that, I think you're alluding to our funding from the Lupus Research Alliance, where we have started to understand that lupus is a very challenging and complex disease. That's the first part. The second part is that lupus is a major health disparity. So it's a biologically sex-driven disease. 90% of the people who have lupus are women or identify as female. And the other percentage, a large majority of those, are women of color. Women of African descent, Asian descent make up a disproportionate majority of people who are diagnosed with this form of lupus. And me personally, I've known several women who either have lupus now or have died from lupus. And so often in the lupus community, it's referred to as this kind of silent killer. People don't understand what's going on. They don't understand fully why there's this disproportionate presentation and pathogenesis of lupus in women of African American descent or African descent. And so coming in, I was like, hey, I'm a Black woman. I'm going to use my privilege and power to try to understand this disease within the context of ancestral background, right? So we study European and African ancestry in its contribution to lupus pathogenesis in our group. We also have started to look at and call attention to the fact that when we create material models outside of the body, say of different tissues, we have our little tissue upstairs, it kind of looks like Jell-O, but the cells that go into that tissue come from people. And so far, we did an analysis last year where we saw that most of the cells that are coming from people are really coming from people of European background. And we realized that depending on your lived experiences and or your ancestral background, your cells will have differences in response to the tissue that you put them in. And so if we don't include other people in our models, we just stay focused on people of European background, we're really limited in how we investigate health right, in our systems. And so one of our new projects is looking at how ancestry plays a role in differences in wound responses. And the last thing I'll say is, you alluded to the pandemic. There was an amazing study that came out in Science in 2021, where they just looked at viral responses based on someone's genetic ancestry. So think about 23andMe, right? If you're 80% African ancestry, 30% European, right? They broke it down by that, and they just looked at how the genetic ancestry influenced viral responses. And they found that if you have African, like majority African ancestry, you have major differentials in how your immune cells respond to viruses. And so it's really exciting, right? That's like the new world where we're understanding health disparities, not just from a social cultural perspective, but also from a genetic and epigenetic perspective, right? And so that's where we're trying to meet in the middle, right, with my group, by creating these tissue models of different people outside of their body. We can take their cells and understand, how will you respond in the face of this viral infection, right? And then better predict models for human health. So that's our research. But again, I do leverage my identity and the privilege that I have in this position to call attention to what I think are largely overlooked issues in my field.
I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about shifting gears back to your work around financial literacy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about More Wealth, the nonprofit that you started. You know, I noted and I said, wow, this is incredible that in your own journey, as you saw your mounting student loan debt, you made a decision, I believe in graduate school, to say, I'm going to pay this off, right? You know, many of us who have been to graduate school will see the mountain and will say, hey, there's no way this may not be possible or feasible. But you made a decision that you did not want to carry this debt into your career. And of course, it drove you clearly to advocate around this issue of college debt, its disproportionate impact on underrepresented minorities, and the need to really tackle this and eradicate it as a vehicle to actually seeing more underrepresented minorities pursue doctorates, go into fields that we need to see representation, not necessarily take jobs just because they need to pay off their debts. And so I was wondering if you could talk about More Wealth, how it got started, and your goals with that organization.
Yeah, that's a great question, David, and I'm happy to share. More Wealth started as a dare from my sister. And so when I was talking with my sister, as you know, when you're in graduate school, there are often moments of existential crisis where you're kind of like, why did I do this? And so when I was having one of those moments, I was talking with one of my older sisters, and I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with my life? And she said two very powerful things. She said, one, you're not a victim, which I always tell her to this day. I was like, wow, shots fired, but it was very true, right? She was just reminding me of my autonomy. And then the second thing she said, well, if you could do anything in the world, what would you do? And I said, I would really try to educate students in financial literacy so that students were more informed and knowledgeable about what they wanted to do next. Right. And I just felt like it was so absent as I navigated higher education. I was like, I want to get this degree. And I didn't know all of the other pieces that came into financing that degree. And as the cost of higher education exponentially almost rises, I felt like it was the last piece of, trying to make sure we had empowered students who knew what they wanted to do and knew the sacrifices financially that they'd have to take in order to achieve that goal. And so that's what urged me to create More Wealth. I really wanted to go speak to students answer their questions, help them become educated around not just their student loans, but also their financial plans for their future, right? So some of the students that I talk to, we hold workshops and partner with different organizations. And the students that I talk to they don't always have a lot of student loan debt, but they do want to study abroad and they don't know how to finance that, right? So then we create a plan together so that they can understand the steps that they can take to finance their dreams and around their education. So that's what created More Wealth. Right now, we have two major arms of More Wealth. The first is scholarships. So we award two scholarships currently. One is the More Wealth Compass Scholarship, and the other one is the Engage Engineering Graduate Access for Engineering Scholarship. And both of those are really geared to help students bridge the gap in terms of their financial needs while encouraging them to begin education around financial literacy. The second arm of More Wealth is workshops, as I alluded to. So I give talks to different student organizations and students who just want to learn more about their finances. Maybe they're in graduate school and they're like, how can I ever buy a house, right? What should I do? How can I buy a house? Or there are other students that say, I just want to buy a car, while I'm in undergrad. Or there are students who are just like, I just don't want to be in over $100,000 worth of debt when I graduate, right? And so all of the different scenarios look differently. We have 6 tenets that we cover, which range from financial psychology to credit awareness, right? And credit utilization. And we cover all of those topics in these workshops. But this is really my goal of kind of giving back and paying it forward, because the moment of panic that I experienced when I realized I was in so much debt, it would just be so great if we could avoid that for all students going forward. That's the goal.
Fantastic. My last question is with regards to public policy. As of course, I'm sure you're aware, the Biden administration, of course, has been under pressure to do something, of course, eradicate student debt. And so that has been a focus of the Biden administration. Of course, they've done significant work around public student loan forgiveness. They've done significant work around canceling debt of students who are taken advantage of by for-profits. But of course, some would say much more work remains to be done. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what can be done from a public policy perspective, when it comes to, for instance, the extension of the grace period for repayments. I think that's up next month. Student loan repayments will resume for many unless there's another extension. My last question for you is with regards to public policy. What do you believe needs to be done with regards to public policy to really help tackle the mountain of student debt that really is on top of so many of our graduates?
Yeah, this is a great question because, as you alluded to, with the mounting pressure that clock is about to end, right? So there's a huge mounting pressure that's just going to start with all of the students or former students and even current students who have not had to pay on their loans throughout the pandemic. And I think this issue is really complicated because policy is complicated. As we see, politics are incredibly complicated. And oftentimes it's hard to move the needle to the degree and extent or accelerated extent that is needed for students who are in critical need or for former students who are in critical need. And so from a public policy standpoint, I almost think that there needs to be more conversations around the utilization of degrees and if they're worth the money that they're costing people, right? So I know that sounds controversial. And so I'll bifurcate my response to say that, yes, I would hope that there would be more programs that would see student loan repayment be obliterated for people who owe on their student loans, right? I know personally, I think all of my siblings have student loan debt. And I know all of them would love to see programs come that would allow them basically to repay their debt where they don't owe $2,000 a month as a minimum payment that doesn't touch principal, right? And so I think there should be a lot more programs and endeavors to help alleviate the burden of student loan debt and those that are not just geared towards public service, right? But in addition, there's the other side of the coin, which I'm going to controversially throw it back to the universities and the people who award the degrees. So from a public policy standpoint, I believe that universities are, the consumer of universities are the students. The universities are providing a service to their students, and the service that's provided should be met with a desired outcome, say a job earning X salary, right? Or say something else that will allow them to offset the financial investment that they made by, consuming that university, is like getting their degree at that university. And so I think universities actually owe a greater burden on their students that they're graduating, right? There should be more published results and statistics about the average student loan burden from each university and the time frame through which students are able to get jobs, what their salaries are broken down by each major. This is starting to grow, right? More and more people are becoming aware of this. But I think if we're thinking broadly from a public policy standpoint, there does need to be more advocacy or holding universities accountable for what they're charging students, right? And how much they're charging it. And so you alluded to some of the predatory for-profit spaces that have seen student loan forgiveness. I would almost argue that the same consideration should be given for nonprofit universities. Right? I think there's similar predatory practices that are occurring in nonprofit spaces, and we do need to create more conversation around them. That's what I'll say from my limited perspective, of course, but I've been to a couple of universities and I'm like, I think we can do better for our students. I think we need to do better for them.
Well, Dr. Moore, I thank you so very much for your time. Much appreciated. The work you're doing is vital, as you know, with regards to the expressed desire of so many to see more underrepresented faculty. Clearly, tackling debt burdens is integral to that work, and I thank you for your advocacy on this issue, and look forward to further engagement with our audience here at Diverse Issues and Higher Education. Thank you so much, Erika, for joining us here on In the Margins. Take care. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.